So, welcome back to the Nerd National Communication Center. I'm Mike, and this is part 3 of C++ single dimensional arrays. In this video, I show you how to total up an array, get the average of an array, and find the minimum and maximum values in the array. If you haven't seen parts 1 and 2, where I show you how to load the array and create the array, check those out. I'll put a link up above and below. So this is part 3 of single dimensional arrays. What we're going to be doing in this part is I'm going to show you how to total up an array of values, average the array of values, and get the minimum and maximum values of the array. Now, how to load the array and how to only load as many grades into the array as you want to, that is parts 1 and 2. So please follow the link to part 1 if you have not watched those before watching this part. So to get the total and the average and the maximum and minimum, we're going to be adding some new variables. We already have the array float grades, which is loaded up with wonderful values, ready to go, ready to do everything we need it to do. And the crowd goes wild. Well, maybe not. But now we're going to add some variables for the total, the average, the minimum, and the maximum. And since this is an array of floating point values, we're going to make these float. So I have float total, which it helps a whole lot if you start your total out at 0. The average value of the array is going to be put into float av. The minimum of all the grades in the array is going to be put into float min, and the maximum is going to get put into float max. So all this code right here where I load the array up until the user types in -1 to exit, I have already gone over in parts 1 and 2. Now let's pick up where we would want to total up the array and get the average. So we need a for loop that is going to cycle through everything in the array. So just as a quick visual aid, this is the typical scenario I'm going to be using to demonstrate this part of the program. I'm going to be loading the array with 3 100s, 3 90s, and 3 80s, and the int number of grades, which is my counter to say how full the array is going to be 9. Now, if you remember, an array has subscripts that tell us how to access each item in the array, starting at 0 and going to 9, because we have an array that is size 10. I'm not using the last box of the array because the user only entered 9 grades. So for instance, the first 80 was typed in is the 7th grade entered, and it goes into subscript number 6 because we started at 0. So if I look at this loop right here, you can see I'm going to total up the array starting at position 0. I'm going to start x at 0, and I'm going to go while x is less than the number of grades the user typed in. So that is going to bring me, if 9 is the number of grades typed in, I'm going to go 0 to 8. 0 to 8 for 9 grades is the subscripts I need to use with my for loop to cycle through the items on the loop. Now, once I'm in the loop, all I have to do is take each grade and add it to the total by using the plus equal operator. So the first time through the loop, x is going to have a value of 0, so we're going to get float grades of 0. That is going to add the 100 to the total. When it gets to the bottom of the for loop, x is going to turn into 1, so the next time it's going to get the 100 and add it to the total, so now the total is going to be 200. Now remember, I started my total out at 0, and it might not have been a bad idea to start out my total at 0 right here so that it is close to the for loop where I'm using it, so that every programmer will understand that I have initialized my total to 0. It's not necessary in this case because when I created it, I started it at 0. But for total purposes, it needs to start at 0. So this is going to loop 9 times, 0 through 8, because I'm saying less than 9, and that's going to get the total. Now, once I have the total, to get the average is real easy. I need to take the total and divide it by the number of grades. Now, there's a bug in this program, which I'll catch later, is what if the user doesn't enter any grades at all? If they just type in -1 for the very first grade entered, then we're going to have 0 grades and it's going to cause an error with the program, possibly crashing my program. So then all I'm doing here is outputting the total number of grades, the total of all those grades, and the average of all those grades. Now lower down here, I'm going to get into getting the minimum and maximum. But I think this would be a good time at this point to run the program so we can see how it works. I'll come up here and hit my green triangle to start the program. And since I run dual screen, it put the code window, the console window on the other screen. I'll drag it onto the screen here, and I'm going to very carefully type in my grades: 100, 100, 100, 90, 90, 90, 80, 80, 80, and then I'll type in -1 because I don't have any more grades I want to enter. Then if you look at the output I've got here, it says the total number of grades was 9. That's what we expected. If I added up those 9 grades, they add up to 810, and the average was 90. And then I have a for loop lower down in the code, which is from parts 1 and 2, that just prints out all the values in the array. Now, when I'm in this mode right here in Visual Studio, it holds the window open and I have to press any key to close the window. So if I do that, it'll be closed. And now we can step through this. Let's step through this for loop using the debugger. So I'm going to put a breakpoint right here on line 64 so the program will pause just before it goes into the loop for totaling up the grades. All right, I'm going to come up here, start my program. I'm going to input my grades very carefully again: 100, 100, 100, 90, 90, 90, 80, 80, 80, -1. So now I've got my 9 grades. I picked these grades very carefully because the average should turn out to be 90. Now I've paused just before it starts running my for loop. If I look at my total has a value of 0. I'm just holding the mouse over the variable name to get a tooltip, and I can see my number of grades is 9. And if I hold my mouse over float grades, it's showing me the grades here. But if I hit this triangle, it'll be much more clear as to where the grades are. You can see the first 3 grades are 100. The next 3 grades, subscript 3, 4, and 5 are 90s, and then at subscript 6, 7, and 8 are 80s, and then you notice the last subscript just has a garbage value in it because we never put any value in it and we never initialized the array. All right, so if I come up here to my favorite button when debugging, step over, it's going to do 1 line of code at a time. Now it's going to add the first 100 to the total. Now you can see my total was 100. If I look at float grades, I just added subscript 0. Because I'm at x equals 0, it's going to hit the bottom of the loop. X is going to go to 1. I'll keep hitting step over. It's back up here. Now x has a value of 1. We're going to be adding a 100 to the total. It hasn't happened yet. It's paused just before running this line of code. If I run this line of code, now if I look at my total, it's 200, and you can see that I've added this 100 and this 100 to the total. And this is going to keep going. I'm going to step through the debugger some. 100, it added 100, a 90, a 90. Okay, let's see where I'm at. I'm now, X is at 6. I just added the grade at position 6, which is an 80 to the total. My total is now 650. It's going to go through the loop 2 more times. Now we just added item number 7, subscript number 7, which is this 80 to the total. Now my total is up to 730, and it's got to add 80 one more time. So it will go back around to the top and say, is X less than number of grades? It is, because number of grades is 9 and X is 8. So it is less than. This is the last time it's going to add the grades. It's going to get the 80 at position 8. 0 through 8, that's 9 grades. Adds it to the total. Now we have a total of 810. This is going to make it drop out of the loop because X, when it got incremented right here, X became a 9, and 9 is no longer less than 9. So it dropped out of the loop. Now we're going to get our average. Right now the average is just flapping in the wind. It's just a garbage value, but we're going to divide 810 by 9. I'll say step over. Now we've got our average. If I tell the program to continue, we'll see my output, and we can see we got number of grades is 9. The sum of all the grades, 810. The average was 90. The minimum grade is 80, and the maximum grade was 100, which is what we expect from the data you're seeing right here, but I haven't showed you that code yet. Now, let's take a look at getting the minimum and the maximum. Since we're interested in the minimum and maximum now, I'm going to take the breakpoint off my for loop for getting the total, and I'm going to scroll down to see where we get the minimum and the maximum. It's right here. Now, a couple things need to happen, and I'm doing a slight optimization. I'm going to assume that the smallest grade in the entire array is at subscript 0. I'm also going to assume that the largest grade is at subscript 0. So we could just set the minimum grade to 110, a very large grade, and we could set the maximum to 0. That would work as well. But if I do it this way, if I take the first grade at position 0 of the array, if I take that first grade, I'm making the minimum 100 and I'm making the maximum 100, and then I'm going to step through the entire array, and as soon as I find a smaller grade, that's going to become the new minimum. And as I keep going through the array, 80 is going to become the minimum. Now the maximum is 100. It's never going to get replaced with another grade because there's not a larger grade in there. And it's going to go through the array starting at position 1, not 0, because we already looked at 0 and made it the minimum and the maximum. So we just need to compare that minimum and maximum to 1 through 8. 1 through the number of grades. All right, so that's what I'm doing here. I'm saying for X equals 1, still want to stay less than the number of grades in the array, and then in the loop, I'm going to say, is this grade in the array smaller than the minimum? If this is a true statement, that becomes the new minimum. Now, while I'm at it, I can also look for the new maximum. I can say if this grade is greater than, oh, I have a typo right there. Look at that. I'm looking for max. If I'm saying if this grade is greater than float minimum, it should be max, then it becomes the new max. So that is the danger of cutting and pasting, because you see these are almost the same set of code. If you copy this and you paste it, then I needed to change float min to float max and float min to float max. So you got to watch out when you cut and paste, because you can inadvertently introduce bugs into your code. So this loop is going to start at 1 and go up to the number of grades that were typed in. So if we're going to go, if there's 9 grades, it'll go 1 to 8. Because remember, if there's 9 grades, position subscript 9 is a no-go. There's no data in it. There's garbage values in it. So we have to start at 1 in this case, looking for the minimum and the maximum, because we already assumed we started at 0, and then we're going to march through the array, and once we get to the end of the values based on int number of grades, we're done. Now, like I said, you can do this both at the same time. So let me set a breakpoint right here, and we will run the program. And when I run the program, of course, I'm going to have to type in the data again. So let's very carefully put in my 3 100s, my 3 90s, and my 3 80s. And then I'll put in -1. So at this point, my program has gotten as far as outputting the number of grades, the sum of all the grades, and the average. Now what we want to see now is how do we get the minimum and the maximum? Well, we started out assuming that the minimum was 100 and the maximum was 100 because we were looking at subscript 0. So if we look at the array, if I open this up right here, we just took the very first entry as the minimum and the maximum, and now we're going to search 1 through 8 to see if there are values that are smaller or values that are larger. So if, let's step through this using step over. So it says if float grades is less than the minimum, it's not, because we're looking at 100 versus 100. This is not going to happen till later. Then that's going to become the new minimum. Now the same thing here. What's in float of x is the 100. So therefore 100 is not greater than 100. So it is not going to replace the grade at position 1. Now, we are going to replace the minimum grade in just a few minutes. So let me step through the debugger. We'll come back around. Now x has a value of 2. If we look at float grades, we're on the last 100, so nothing's going to happen here. When we get to the next time around, we should have a new minimum. This 90 should replace the 100. So let's step through it. I'll keep hitting step over. Comes back around. Now x has a value of 3. If I look at float grades of 3, that's a 90. So 90 should be less than the current minimum. That's a true statement. So now my minimum is 90. And if I keep going through this, I've got to go around 3 more times. And now we are at subscript 5. So if I look at array position 5, that's still a 90. We got to go around 1 more time. This time we're at subscript number 6. If we look at x, and if I look at the array subscript number 6, it has an 80 in it. So this will become the new minimum. And that's a true statement. This condition right here is true because 80 is less than 90. So that becomes my new minimum of 80, and it's going to keep going. Now we never trigger the maximum because of the data I picked. We never get larger values because we started out, coincidentally, we just got lucky, and subscript 0 was the largest value. And this will keep going till it gets to the end of the array, and then it will jump out of the for loop, and it's going to print out the minimum, print out the maximum. And then finally, the last thing I do is, this is the exact same for loop from parts 1 and 2, where I just print the array out. So if I tell the program to continue, and I look at my output window, let me press enter here. There we go. Now you can see it got my minimum of 80, my maximum of 100, and then it printed out the values in the array. There are some problems with this code, however. When we are getting the average, what if the user only typed in 1 grade? What if the user typed in no grades? So let's try that. I'm going to run the program, and I'm going to type in just 1 grade here. I'll type in 85, and then I'll put in -1. So the number of items in my array is 1, so it's only going to go through the total loop 1 time, and my total was 85. My number of grades is 1, so 85 divided by 1, we got the correct average. There's one grade, that is your average. And the minimum and maximum is also going to work. So with one grade, everything worked. But let's see what happens if I type in 0 grades. What if I come into the program and I immediately type in -1? Well, number of grades 0, that's okay. Sum of all grades 0, that's okay. And here we have an error because we're trying to divide by 0. Because at the point that we went through this loop no times with the total, because it says for x equals 0, keep going while x is less than 0, because we have 0 grades. And then here we're trying to divide by 0, which will crash many programs. So we actually need to protect this situation right here and not do the loop at all if actually, this is correct. This is getting the right total because it's not going through the loop at all. The problem is we need to have an if statement right here and not divide by 0 if there are no grades. So you watch out for that. So we'd have to say if int number of grades, and I can just hit tab right here, is equal to 0, then what do we want to do? We can just define the average to be 0, and then we can come down here and say else, and if the number of grades is non-zero, then we're fine. We can divide by the number of grades. So that will fix that problem. So even on a simple program like this, there are details you have to worry about. We do not want to divide by 0, so we need to be aware that if we have 0 grades, we have to have an if statement to handle that. And we also need to handle that here. If there are no grades, there is no minimum and maximum. So this entire sequence right here needs to be put in an additional if statement. So we only do this if the number of grades is greater than 0. Now, instead of you watching me peck away on the keyboard in front of you, I'm going to pause the video and add that code. So now I've added an if statement that say, if the number of grades is greater than 0, then we're going to do the identical code that I showed you. We're going to assume the minimum and the maximum are at subscript 0. Then we're going to step through the array looking for the new minimum and maximum, and then we're going to print it out. Else, in other words, if the number of grades was 0, cout, no grades defined, minimum or maximum. So we have to handle that case as well. So if I run the program again, let me get it going here. If I'm running the program again here and I type in -1, hopefully it's going to handle it. So it's going to come out and say number of grades is 0, sum of all grades is 0, the average is 0, no grades defined, minimum or maximum. So everything is working correctly. Now even now though, this code is not totally optimized. Why am I going through looking at all the values in the array to add them up here, but just a moment later I'm going through the exact same data again with another for loop, revisiting the data unnecessarily? As I'm looking for the minimum and the maximum, I could be doing the total as well. So I can make a couple simple changes to the code, which I'll do off screen, and I will eliminate this for loop and make my program more efficient. Let me do that off screen. So I put the code changes in to do the totaling of the grades as I look for the minimum and maximums. So the changes I had to do are marked in yellow because I have not hit save yet, so you can see which lines were changed. So I've moved setting my total to 0 just before my if statement to see if we have more than one grade. And since our loop isn't starting at 1, I need to add the very first grade to the total before I go into the loop, and then the loop will go through the rest of the grades in the array and add each of them to the total. And then while we're in the loop, we'll look for a new minimum and we'll look for a new maximum. Now, if we had grades, then I can calculate my average. Else, where I had my cout to say there are no grades to find the minimum or the maximum, I can set my average to 0, and then I moved my output of the number of grades, the sum of all grades, and the average grade down to the bottom of the code. So I'm going to run the program one last time, and we can see this all work with the optimizations. And here we go. Let's put in my great test data. And -1. So now we've hit my for loop looking for the minimum and maximums. We're starting at 1. So I've already set my total to 100. And as I step through this loop, it'll add the next grade. Now my total is 200. And it'll check for the minimums and the maximums. And I'm going to just tell the program to continue. And we can look at the output on the screen and see if everything came out right. So now we can see that the minimum grade found was 80, the maximum grade was 100, the number of grades is 90, and the sum of all grades was 810 with an average of 90. And then here is all of my output. Now I can hit spacebar to have it end. Let's check my edge conditions. I'm going to run the program again. And this time I'm going to type in one grade. I'll type in an 85 and then a -1. Let's tell my program to continue. Tell you what, I'm not going to stop at the debugger anymore, so I'm going to turn that breakpoint off. Tell my program to continue, and we can look at the output. So if we look at my output, minimum is 85, maximum is 85, number of grades is 1, 85 for the sum, 85 for the average, and here's all my values printed out. That worked. And drum roll, we'll try it one last time. We will immediately type in -1, and we can see it says no grades to find minimum or maximum, number of grades 0, sum of all grades 0, average grade 0. Everything is working. I've covered the edge conditions, and that is going to do it for single dimensional arrays. If you like these kind of programs and videos, I would ask you to please like and subscribe so you will get notification of additional C++ videos, C# for Windows videos, and PC hardware videos, and whatever else I feel like putting on the channel. Thanks a lot. Take care.